welcome back to this gentle parenting series. My name is Kitty Hackle. I'm mum to 3 little people. I'm also registered general nurse, lactation consultant, hypnobirthing instructor, antenatal educator, birth and postpartum doula. And today I'm going to be talking about the lessons that I have learned on my journey in gentle, positive, respectful parenting, under the title of things that I don't do in parenting my children. But I've decided to call this lessons that I have learned, because they are things that maybe initially on our parenting journey I didn't know, and it's something that I have figured out along the way. And I think really when it comes to learning from our peers and learning from our experiences, that is the best way to remember things. And for me, this is something that I could only figure out by doing it wrong and realizing that that maybe wasn't the way forward. So to start, I've got them all written out because goodness knows mom brain and I will forget all of these things. But I wanted to begin with remembering that as adults we don't always get it right, and that those mistakes are a part of being human, and really we're all just parenting for the first time and parenting that child for the first time. So whether it's your first or your 5th baby, we're parenting that child for the first time and going through that phase of parenting with that child for the first time. So for me, parenting each child has been very, very different. So one of the biggest things that I wanted to remember and to remind you guys is that just in the same way we expect our children to apologize when they behave in a way that isn't okay or we're not okay with, we should also be okay with apologizing. And that is something that feels so weird when you do it for the first time, when you're apologizing to your 3-year-old because you raised your voice and it wasn't a necessary thing to do, or you maybe frighten them when you raise your voice. So being okay with apologizing is huge. In this scenario, we're talking about maybe getting down to their level, making that eye contact again, coming back to where your toddler is at or your little person is at, if it's a 10-year-old. Quite recently, I had to apologize to my 10-year-old. And I just said, hey, Jess, I'm really sorry for raising my voice like that. I wanted you to get out of the road because a car was coming and I was worried about your safety. Next time, I will make sure that I catch your attention a little bit sooner. Next time, we'll both keep a closer eye on when traffic is coming, or next time we'll walk along the pathway. So you're making sure that not only are you creating an example of apologizing to your children, so they are more likely to apologize to you the next time, but also it shows them that there's nothing to hide. There's no reason for them to think that they have to be perfect all the time, because they see that you're not perfect all the time. So that it means that when our children are teenagers and they make a mistake when they're out with their friends, or they maybe do something that they know that isn't really an okay thing to do, maybe they stole something, maybe they broke something, they know that they can come back to you, because the first place where they see mistakes being made and it being okay to make those mistakes is in their parents, in those people who are supporting them, loving them, guiding them. So creating an example is one of the biggest things that you can do. So that's probably the first thing that I have learned, is that you don't need to pretend to be perfect in your parenting journey, and that coming back and actually apologizing to your children when you make a mistake is really beneficial. So I'm really sorry for doing XYZ. That was wrong of me. So taking a full ownership over that. What am I going to change? Next time I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. So you're taking ownership, you're being that example, and it means that your child is more likely to come to you the next time they make a big mistake. So following along with that last example of where you are actually making the apology for mistakes that you have made, we also don't practice empty apologies in our family, or at the very least we try not to. It's something that I was taught to do as a child and very much comes out of my mouth sometimes without even realizing it. But actually what we're doing by teaching empty apologies, i.e. you pushed your brother off your bike, go and say sorry to him, is they don't understand why they're doing it. So instead of creating this sort of non-emotive response where they're not really understanding the apology or why it was ever not an okay thing to do in the first place, you do the apology for them. So you're going over to the child and you're saying, hi, are you okay? Can I help you up? I'm really sorry that Atticus pushed you off the bike. That wasn't okay. So you're showing Atticus that that wasn't an okay thing to do. My poor child, I'm using him as a constant example, that wasn't an okay thing to do. And he can see that mummy was going in and checking in on that child, and that she is apologizing because it wasn't an okay thing to do and not something that he should be doing in the future. also making sure that you are going in and checking on that child first, as opposed to rushing straight to the child who has done the thing. So whether it's, the scenario of pushing off the bicycle, if it's kicking, if it's biting, if it's any of those things, by giving immediate attention to the child who has done that bad thing or that big thing, that you are giving the attention there that maybe they are striving for. So instead, making sure that you're always placing the focus on the child who has been hurt or who has been the victim of biting or pushing or whatever that is. So the next thing that I'm only going to do 3, I think, today, but the next thing that we use, or have decided not to use anymore in terms of the way that we parent our children, is, I was so guilty of this, but I used to say, if we were leaving and I was having a really hard time maybe getting my child out of the park or whatever it was, or leaving a friend's house, I would say, okay, mummy's going now, bye. And I have realised through some of the accounts that I have followed, through some of the things that I have listened to, through going through therapy myself and having maybe some worries that I was ever going to be left or abandoned, TMI there, you did not need to know that actually what I was telling my child is that if you don't follow this rule or this instruction, that someday mummy could leave you. And I don't want my children to ever worry about that. So now, instead of saying like, okay, I'm leaving without you, bye, we all know that it's easy to do that if you're having that battle. But instead, what we do is we okay the feeling, you don't want to leave here right now. I can see that you're having so much fun. And we're talking about creating the boundary, but it's time to go. Stating that boundary. I can see that you're having a really hard time leaving, so I'm going to help you. And then following through with that and moving it to a positive. So you'll see this 4-step process that I really try my best to incorporate in any of our kind of toddler meltdowns, any of those big situations. But instead, by sticking to that four kind of step rule in creating that really clear boundary, the more often that we have that really clear, like, I see you, I hear you, however, here's the boundary, the less likely we are to come up against having to physically move our child or resort to holding them, carrying them to leave that situation in the future, because they know exactly what to expect. So 4-step rule, come back to listening to their emotions, coming down to their level, seeing where they're at. I can see you really don't want to leave right now. You're having so much fun. Laying down the boundary. It's time to go. Reinforcing that boundary. I can see you're having a really hard time leaving right now. Mummy's going to help you now. Switching to the positive. Would you like to walk or would you like me to carry you? So it means that they know what exactly to expect, but you're not setting them up for that worry or that fear that someday your caregiver might actually leave you or abandon you. And this isn't going to be a worry for all children. This is obviously something that is very personal, but we don't want it to be something that your child could ever have to worry about, right? The next phrase that I choose not to use, or I have learnt not to use in my teachings, my learnings of becoming a parent, is the phrase, be careful. And certainly as a parent of 2 boys, where we have these rambunctious little kids who want to climb walls and trees and splash in streams and always come home covered in mud and dirt and just living their life, it can be very easy for me to constantly want to wrap them up in cotton wool, basically, to want to hold their hand, to tell them to be careful over and over and over again. And actually, when you think about it, that message that we're telling our children is that the world is dangerous, and that you have to be constantly unaware because something bad could happen, and they should constantly be aware of that there is something to be fearful of. And that, for me, is not something that I want to instill in my children. I want them to be excited to adventure, to explore, and particularly with little boys. There's a fantastic podcast that an episode that I listened to a while ago now, and I'll try and find it for you, but it's from the Raising Boys podcast, and they talked about the importance of boys in particular moving with their bodies and the physicality and the learning that came from making those mistakes, and that actually boys need to fall multiple times in the same way before they figure out that awareness of their body, their coordination, their balance, to know to not do that again. Whereas for little girls, they figure it out that little bit faster, just because their brain doesn't prioritize physical development over emotional development and communication. So boys and girls totally differently in terms of the way that their brains develop. But instead of using that phrase, be careful, be careful, be careful, which becomes a meaningless, empty statement at the end of the day because it has no meaning behind it, because they don't understand what they're being careful of, I change it to different phrasing. So I will ask constantly using my 3-year-old as an example, I will ask Atticus, I will say, you know, as he's climbing across a wall that's maybe a little bit wobbly, I will say, do you feel safe doing that? So I'm asking him, so he's being triggered to then check in with his body and see what he's doing and see, does he feel safe? Because I trust that he knows what feels safe and what doesn't. And this obviously isn't something you want to be doing and trusting from the outset. This is something that we've built on over time. So for a smaller child, you could maybe say, you know, is that rock underneath you wobbling? You could maybe ask them to check in with, you know, their hands and their feet. So like, hey, they're climbing down a mountain, and you could say like, okay, let's try going backwards. That could be a bit safer. So you're teaching them the skills, they're doing more check-ins with their own body, as opposed to it being like this empty, meaningless statement that's just encouraging them to have more fear when it comes to the way that they explore the world. So those are 3 things that I have learned that I don't want to be practicing in the way that I do gentle parenting of my children. And let me know down below if there's anything else that you have decided not to do. I also have a video on the 10 things that I do as a positive gentle parent and the 10 things that I don't do. So that might cover in a little bit more detail some of the things that I have decided not to do in the way that I am raising these little humans. I hope that you're enjoying this little series, and make sure and tell me down below if you found any of these resources helpful and if you've had any success with any of the little tools that you might have been applying.